Well, the bell rang, so we'll give everybody a chance to get on in here and get settled in. I know everybody's having a good time visiting. That's good and all. But we will go ahead and get started. Last week, we began studying the third letter of John in our series looking through these letters. We're going to wrap it up today. Of course, we've already gone through 2 John, spent 2 or 3 weeks in that, and these two letters are very closely connected. You'll recall, because we made our way through the first half of the book last week, that in both cases, the author introduces himself as the elder. We've talked about that already at length. Indicates his authority, his office in the church, but also a term of respect, of affection due to his age. And of course, the elder, as we've said before, is the Apostle John. Both this letter and 2 John also have some similarities in their contents. There's an emphasis on truth and love and how those two things are connected. We saw that in the salutation last week, those first 4 verses, where he calls Gaius beloved, and he says he rejoices that he's walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. So both of them have those same thematic emphasis. Both of them also deal with hospitality, though in different ways. We're going to see that come through clearly today. If you remember, in 2 John, the focus is on not extending hospitality to false teachers, forbidding that, because if you welcome them in, you're participating in their evil deeds. John says you're giving them a platform. And if you remember what we've said, hospitality is about more than just the practical aspect of it, giving them a place to stay, giving them food to eat so that they physically can be there. It also has a social dimension in the first century world, where if a stranger comes into the community and you allow them to stay in your home, basically you're lending them the same social status you have. So you're vouching for them. In other words, you're giving them legitimacy, and that's why you're a participant in this. And so what we're going to see today, on the one hand, we saw this last week, that John commends Gaius, the fellow he's writing to in this third letter, for extending hospitality to strangers, to those brothers he sent out. But today, we're going to see where he talks about another fellow, Diotrephes, who has not extended it the way that he ought. And so that brings us to the fact that there are some differences here between these two books that relate to their slightly different occasions, their different purposes. In terms of the purpose of 3 John, and thinking of some of the things we saw last week, John has apparently sent out some others, some missionaries, evangelists, whatever you want to call them, some of his people who have gone out to other churches, they've come back, they've reported to him. One thing they tell him is they speak really highly of Gaius because he entertained them. That's there in verse number 5. But on the other hand, another man, Diotrephes, who we'll get to today, had not been prepared to receive them. In fact, he's even gone so far as to ban others in the church from welcoming them in. He's even spreading gossip, malicious stories about the apostle. That's down in verse number 10. We'll talk about this a little more in a moment. Not sure whether Diotrephes is actually a formal leader in the church or if he's just someone who sort of assumed that position for himself. But at any rate, he didn't acknowledge John's authority. And so John writes to Gaius to bring him up to speed on all these goings on, and in particular then to commend another man, verse 12, Demetrius, to him. It seems overall that the big purpose of this letter is to make sure that Gaius remains a faithful and a loyal co-worker, that he's somebody John can count on, especially since things are in a real crisis state. Despite Diotrephes' rejection, that John can rely on Gaius. Demetrius, that he sent to him, Demetrius is going to help him to do that. And John indicates here at the very end that he's planning to come soon. And so that will be even more backup there. So we worked our way through the first half of the text last week, verses 1 through 8, really all one paragraph in a lot of ways. You have a paragraph break there between verses 8 and 9, which is where we'll get to today. But just to reiterate a little bit more of that, this letter is addressed to Gaius. We said we don't know anything more about this Gaius. There are at least 2, 3, maybe as many as 4 different men named Gaius that we encounter in the New Testament, but it was also an extremely common name, either the first or second most common personal name in the Roman world. So this guy could have been anybody, but what we do know about him that we can infer from the letter itself is that he was true to the faith. He walked in the truth. Verse 3, verse 4. He was widely respected. Verse 3, the brothers testify to this. Everybody knows this about Gaius. And it seems that he exercised some degree of influence in the church, at least in his local congregation, verses 5 and 6. Because not only does everybody know this about Gaius, that he's hospitable, that he walks in the truth, that was actually testified before the church. It seems to imply in the assembly there in verse number 6. Beyond that, he clearly has a close, personal, a warm relationship with John, and you see that from the fact that he addresses him at the very beginning there, verse 2, as beloved, or my dear friend, your translation may say. And that's not only in verse number 2, but it's there again in verse number 5. We'll see it today, verse number 11. So all that emphasizes that strong bond of Christian fellowship that existed between John and Gaius. And then in verses 5 through 8 that we saw last week, we get into the purpose of this letter. And it really gives us a glimpse into ministry in the church in the first century. John's fundamentally, practically, if we talk about the practical purpose for this letter, he's writing for one thing to request hospitality for Demetrius. We're going to see that today. But he opens up here by affirming Gaius's hospitality. There in verse number 5, what you're doing for these other brothers reflects your faithfulness. And it's implied that he's done this many times. That is, that Gaius regularly extends hospitality to traveling Christians. And he's not doing this because he knows them on the basis of personal friendship. They're strangers, John says there in verse number 5. So in other words, Gaius is welcomed into his home, fellow believers who are otherwise unknown to him. It's a virtue that he's practicing there. John's received good reports about that. The churches have received good reports about it. And we've already hit on today what we talked a lot about last week. The reason that hospitality was so important in the ancient world, not just for the practical reasons of giving them a place to stay, but also for those social reasons of giving them credibility. But then he shifts from what he's done in the past to this future expectation that you will do well, verse number 6. And so it introduces this idea that John's asking Gaius to keep on doing, to do another time what he's already done before. And the whole idea, the basis of this request is that he says, these travelers have gone out for the sake of the name, for the sake of Jesus, verse 7. And they're not going to receive any help from unbelievers along the way, from the Gentiles, John calls them. So it's especially important for people like Gaius to feed and to shelter these missionaries as they go out on their way. As a result, we ought to support people like these, verse number 8. Not only because they're brothers going out for the sake of the name, and not only because they have no other means of support, but because in doing so, we are fellow workers of the truth. That's the end of verse number 8. So it reminds us that mission work isn't just done by those that actually go to foreign countries, those that actually preach the gospel, but when we do things like support those missionaries that we do here in this church, that we're part of that. We're doing that work too. So with all that said, this morning we're going to finish up the letter with this second major section, starting in verse number 9. This need for Gaius to extend hospitality is amplified by the extenuating circumstance of this other man, Diotrephes, who has not only failed to extend it himself, but is forbidding others from doing it too. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I'll bring up what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. I had much to write to you, but I'd rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we'll talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, each by name. So the focus of the letter shifts now in verse number 9 to this problem of authority in the church. John has advised Gaius to be hospitable, that when you're doing that, you're a fellow worker for the truth. So Diotrephes' refusal to extend hospitality calls into question his loyalty. Is he loyal to Christ? Does he have allegiance to the truth? John says he'd already written something to the church there, and Diotrephes hadn't received it. The question is this one of the letters that we also know about, 1 John, 2 John, or is it some other letter otherwise unknown to us? You know, it could be that John just wrote a letter kind of like 3 John here to Diotrephes, asking him for hospitality, asking him to receive these fellows that he sent out from him, and Diotrephes had no interest in that, wadded up, threw it away, whatever, kicked the guys out. It could also be that John's referring here to 2 John, if that letter was written to a church or churches intended to circulate and not just written to an individual. It could be that 1 John was even included in that that's the sort of sermon about dealing with these false teachers. 2 John could have been a cover letter for that. Or maybe it's not both of them. Maybe it's 1 John in itself. Maybe that's what he didn't receive. We just don't know. So much of that depends on how you reconstruct the relationship between these letters. And I'm not sure that matters so much. But in terms of Diotrephes himself, he's described here as one who likes to put himself first in verse number 9. In other words, it seems pretty much that as Diotrephes goes, so goes the church there that he's a part of. And we said already, it's not clear if he's a rightful leader in the church. Maybe he's an elder in this congregation. Maybe he's a teacher or a preacher. But maybe he's not. Maybe he's just an influential member. He could have been someone who is important in the community. Obviously, if John is expecting him to extend hospitality, he must be someone of some importance and of means, someone who can afford to put up people. And so it could be that he was someone who hosted the church in his house. I mean, we know in the first century, it's not like they had a church building like this, right? Everybody met in someone's home, and we have several mentions of individuals who hosted churches in their houses in the New Testament. So it could be that Diotrephes was someone like that. And even then, if he wasn't an elder, a preacher, a teacher, if they were meeting in his house, you could see where he would have a tremendous degree of influence even outside that formal structure. Or maybe he's none of those things. Maybe he's just a guy who had a forceful personality. Maybe he's just charismatic. Maybe people listen to him. He gets his way a lot. In any case, his exact status doesn't really matter, because the problem is his attitude is exactly the opposite of what Jesus said a leader in the church should be. He's not someone who's humble. He's not someone who's practicing servant leadership. He's someone who insists on his way. He wants to be first. He likes it. He likes being in control of things. And even if he had an official position, even if he was an elder, that wouldn't excuse the fact that he's trying to use his office to advance his own personal ambition and his own power here. In particular, the problem that John raises here is that he does not welcome us. Now, I'd read from the English Standard, the ESV says that he does not acknowledge our authority. That's actually probably not the best translation here. More literally, if you have a King James, for instance, or if you have an NIV, it will say that he doesn't welcome us, or he receiveth us not, I think the King James says. But that's the sense here. When it says that he doesn't acknowledge our authority, like the ESV does, that's not literally what the words mean. That's more of an interpretation of his motive. And I don't think that's wrong. That is really an accurate interpretation of his motive in context. He is rejecting John and his authority. But that's not literally what the words say. It's again coming back to this theme of hospitality that we've seen earlier in this letter, that he's not welcoming us, people from John, in. And John's going to come back to that with more details there in verse 10. We'll see it in a moment. Really, this verse expands on what Diotrephes is doing. For one thing, he's talking wicked nonsense against us. He's disparaging John with evil words, some versions say. Wicked nonsense, the ESV says. That verb, that talking there, as it says here, it's the only time this word appears in all the New Testament. And it carries this idea of saying ugly things about someone, disparaging them, slandering them. So it's more than just talking. It's talking bad about him. And he isn't just throwing out some mild inaccuracies. He's actually saying evil things, wicked nonsense, serious, malicious, wicked accusations. Beyond that, we get back to this problem of hospitality. He refused to welcome the brothers. So his quarrel isn't just with John, it's from anyone associated with John. He has no interest in welcoming them in at all. If you've got any ties to John, any connections to him, he's not going to welcome you. And then, it's not just that he personally refuses to welcome them. He stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. So, he not only won't welcome people from John, he refuses to permit others in the congregation from doing it. And mind you, did you notice? It's not just if you actually host someone from John that he's going to force you out. If you just want to, if you wish to, if you have the desire, if you're friendly toward John at all, he's going to have you thrown out. So all that's to say, this is way beyond a personal feud. When it's spread to the whole church like that, everyone is forced to take sides. Are they going to follow Diotrephes' position, or are they going to be loyal to the apostle and then be refused fellowship in the church? Which, in the first century, it's not like you could just go down the street, okay, well, I'm not in this congregation anymore, but you know what, I'll go to that one across town, no big deal. No, there might not be another one in town. So what do you do? It's a real dilemma. And it points out to us again, whatever his position was, whether he was officially in charge or not, Diotrephes evidently had the power to pull this off. And that's some serious pull. If you can just say, all right, buddy, you're out. You're not a member here anymore because you associate or want to associate or are sympathetic towards John. That's serious influence that he has. So you put all that together. In short, Diotrephes has damaged the elder by slandering him. He's damaged the traveling preachers and teachers by refusing them food and shelter, which, remember how that's related to their status, related to their legitimacy. To refuse hospitality to them was essentially an act of war, in some sense, against John. It was rejecting John, showing ill will toward him. And then he's damaged the local church, causing a conflict there, one that evidently threatened to spread to other local congregations in the wider area. So this is a huge problem. All this documented here in just a couple of sentences in this brief letter. But when you start to unpack it, you realize, wow, what a really grave issue this is. And I think all that pretty strongly implies that Gaius is probably not a member of the same church, same local congregation that Diotrephes is, because if he were, why would John need to write to him to bring him up to speed on all of this? But probably Gaius is a leader in a nearby church, a neighboring city, one that had interaction with Diotrephes' congregation, one that you could travel easily to and from, one that was at risk of being infected by this same sort of dissension. And so John turns his thoughts back to Gaius there, verse 11. This is the only imperative, the only command in the book. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. What Diotrephes is doing is evil. Don't be like him. Don't imitate him. Instead, do good. Be John's ally. Receive his people. Stand firm against Diotrephes. When you do that, you remain on God's side. The question we all have when we read this is, what's this guy's problem? What is it, the underlying issue that caused Diotrephes to be so hostile to John? And there's been several different suggestions that have been put forth. Some have argued that it's primarily political here. There's lots of different variations on this, but the upshot is, here at the end of the first century, we're in a transition period, because for the half century previous, there's been apostles around who have carried some sort of personal authority, and we know there that in their particular regions, you think about Paul, even though he appointed elders in all the churches that he helped establish, he still feels some degree of responsibility, has some degree of oversight in an unrepeatable fashion. Only apostles have that. But he has some degree of oversight over all those. The same thing with John. He evidently feels some responsibility for these churches throughout Asia Minor. You could think even of Revelation and how he writes to those 7 churches there. So maybe in this transition period, John's the last apostle, Diotrephes is here in his local church, and maybe he just resents some outsider coming along and trying to tell him what to do. And as I say, there's lots of variations on that. Maybe Diotrephes is an elder and he doesn't like it. Maybe he's just some charismatic leader and he resents the apostles. We don't know, but the upshot is I think this depends on assuming that Diotrephes is an official leader in the church. And we don't know that. It could be possible, but we don't know that just from this letter. Text doesn't say anything about it. So another possibility that some have put forward is that this is tied to 2 John and 1 John and those false teachers that we see John grappling with there. And if you start to bring those other 2 letters in, that does have more textual support, that maybe Diotrephes is a false teacher or aligned with these false teachers that John is warning about. But the problem with that is that there's little, if any, evidence that John considers Diotrephes to be a heretic, to be a false teacher. After all, you think about the sort of language we've seen him use before. He doesn't call him an antichrist. He doesn't call him a false teacher. He's had no problem, he's not going to pull his punches as far as that goes. He doesn't even say that he's welcomed those false teachers in and thus become associated with them. So it could be, based on what we know is going on around this time, it could be that Diotrephes was leaning that way. It could be that he was associated with him. But if that's the case, John doesn't mention it. And to say that he's one of those or the ringleader of the false teachers, as some have even argued, that to me seems unlikely just based on the way he talks about him here. Because whatever the underlying issue is here, the pretext really for this falling out, the biggest problem with Diotrephes is a character flaw. That's the biggest problem beyond any other sort of disagreement, real or imagined, they may have. Diotrephes was precisely the type of leader that the New Testament warns against again and again and again. Jesus warns against them. Paul does. Peter does when he says elders ought not to lord it over their charge. That's what Diotrephes wanted to do. He wanted to lord it over that congregation. He wanted to be first. He wanted to call the shots. He wanted to get his way. Whether he had an official position in the church or not, whether, whatever the root issue was here, in a sense, that's moot, because it's clear he was a man of influence, he was a man of means, and he used that, however he had it, to throw his weight around and to get his way. The big problem is him rejecting the apostles' authority for his own authority. And the question is, and this is to bring things current, kind of like we talked about with hospitality last week. Do we have to deal with people like Diotrephes in the church today? Sure. Yeah. Absolutely we do. I'm not singling anyone out in here, by the way, when I ask that question. Unfortunately, we do. Probably we could go around the room and we could all relate some personal experience, maybe more than one, that we've had in dealing with Diotrephes in the congregation. Maybe he was in a church we were a part of, and he was one of the elders, or he was the preacher. Maybe those of you who are elders, maybe you've had to deal with those among the members who try to get their way on certain things. But not only do we have to deal with these, in my experience, this is the single biggest reason why churches split. The problem, more often than not, is not a matter of false teaching. It's not a matter of bad theology or doctrine. It's pride. It's faulty leading. And I've seen that firsthand. So rather than asking for other experiences, I'm going to tell a little bit of something that I had to deal with. This was when I was in high school. And the shortest version of getting into this, the fellow who was the preacher in the church that I'd grown up attending, he had pretty openly, it was an open secret, it was public knowledge around town, he'd started carrying on with another woman. And he ended up resigning, but he was still going to church, so I'm still associated with it. And the elders reached out to him, trying to get him and this woman, who was also a member of the church, to repent. They wouldn't. So they determined they were going to withdraw from them, withdraw fellowship, finally. A group of men, influential men in the congregation, got together, held a secret meeting. Not everyone was invited to it. They drafted a letter, sent it to the elders, and the gist of that letter was, you don't have the right to do this without our approval. You need to ask the whole church to be able to approve this sort of thing. They didn't want it done because it would be an embarrassment. I mean, they'd lose face to see that, the preacher here in the church, he's been sort of called out, thrown out, basically disfellowshipped. And the upshot of this was they put enough pressure on different elders. There were 4 at first. One by one, a couple of them resigned. Finally, they forced it to where there were no elders. The eldership was dissolved. It was chaos. And then we went through a process of selecting new elders, but it was just in a men's business meeting at this point. And some of those men who'd written that letter were kind of in control of things. If anyone rightly wanted to talk about this letter, objected to it because it had caused dissension, and because these were men who rebelled against the elders, they just shut that down, didn't want to talk about it anymore. Many of these same men who had been part of this coup, really, for lack of a better term, they desired to be elders themselves. And of course, a good number of people objected to that because they'd already shown that they didn't have the right understanding of the position of an elder, and they didn't submit themselves. And so ultimately that split the church, and fundamentally it was because of pride. It was because of people who wanted to be in control, who wanted to have things their way. That's a shame. But the flip side of that is those men who wrote that letter and who were responsible for trying to ride roughshod over the elders weren't the only Diotrephes types in this whole scenario. Here's the other side of things. Before the elders, there were two at this point, gone from 4 down to 2. Before the eldership was dissolved, they'd brought in, because we don't have a preacher, remember, they'd brought in someone from outside, someone whose name I won't call because some of you might have heard this name. It's a pretty big name in the church at the time. They brought in this fellow essentially as a hired gun to try to come in and restore order, to preach a bunch of sermons on the eldership and the responsibility to them, and to try to prepare us for installing new elders. But this fellow came in, and rather than being a peacemaker, rather than trying to unify, to settle things down, to bring everyone back together, he poked the bear. He stirred things up just as much as he possibly could. And ultimately, when things got tough, they got too hot for him there after there were no elders and he was getting all sorts of pressure from a big contingent of the congregation, he just resigned. He just got out of Dodge, tucked tail and ran. Fast forward a few years later, 3 years, I guess, 4 years. I was going to school at the University of Texas. I was a member of the church there, the Southwest Church of Christ in Austin. Southwest has a school of preaching, school of biblical studies. This same preacher came to give essentially the commencement address. He spoke there. He preached Sunday morning, Sunday night. He was an alumnus of it. The fellow who was the youth minister in Marshall when all this was going on, and remember, I was in high school at the time, so my youth minister, he was the youth minister now, the high school kids, in Austin there at Southwest. And so when this preacher got up in the pulpit making his introductory comments, he said that, me and this guy, we served in Marshall together, and boy, we really stood toe-to-toe, took it to the liberals there in Marshall and fought the good fight of the faith, etc. And it was so bad there that once in a meeting, some of the men were saying ugly, malicious things about us, and one of the young men, a teenager, got up and he said, "What you're saying about these men is not right. The way that you're conducting yourself is not Christian." And that all happened. Well, after services, I went up to talk to this. We'll use this one now. So, after services, I went up to talk to this preacher. I thought that I needed to because the kid he was talking about was me. I was the one who'd done that in that men's business meeting. And I went up to him and I said, "Well, I just thought I should come, say hello since you talked about me in the sermon." He didn't remember me. Now, this is only, as I say, 3-4 years later, so it's not like I've aged up 50 years. I looked basically the same, and he remembered the story, but he didn't know me by sight. And that didn't bother me on a personal level. What bothered me was I realized that this was just a story to him. He didn't care about that congregation. He didn't care about all the lives that were damaged. This was just another notch in his gun belt, and he had showed just how great and how devout a defender of the faith that he was. He bragged on this like he'd done a good thing when really he'd gone in and stirred up the hornet's nest, and he was partially responsible for splitting the church. He was just as much a Diotrephes as that group of men was. So I say all that to say, there was a real fundamental disagreement in that congregation, a serious doctrinal disagreement. And I think there was a clear right and wrong there. And in fact, ultimately, when it split, I went with the group that split off, the ones that didn't submit to those elders that we felt weren't in the right position there. And I think in the end, that was the right thing to do, though I regret the whole scenario that it had to fall out that way. And the point is, even with a serious disagreement like that, less pride and more leadership would have kept that church together. There was a real fundamental disagreement, yeah, but it was that spirit of Diotrephes on both sides that caused the split. And that's the case in most situations like this. In contrast to that, as we drive towards the close here, John holds Demetrius up as a good example. We read this already. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. Probably Demetrius was the one who was carrying this letter from John. He was one of his men, one of his messengers. Maybe he had even been one of the ones who'd gone to Diotrephes and had been rejected by him in the first place. But you notice John gives three pretty impressive references for him. One is that everyone vouched for him. Everyone who knew him had good things to say about him. No one lacked confidence in his character, in his integrity. Second reference, he lived a life that was in alignment with the truth. The truth itself testifies to it. Unlike Diotrephes, his life was in accordance with truth and with love. And then, of course, finally, John gave his own stamp of approval. We add our testimony. You know that that's true, he says. So not only is this an implicit appeal to welcome in Demetrius, to receive him, I'm commending him to you. This is a letter of recommendation, but I think also it's designed to encourage Gaius, because he's going to be facing a really difficult situation. He's written here about Diotrephes, and if Gaius didn't know this already, he's probably getting really nervous, antsy about this whole situation. And you can almost picture him here, seeing Demetrius in front of him and reading this recommendation and just sort of letting out the sigh of relief. Okay, well, at least I'm not going to be alone in all of this. And of course, not only is there Demetrius, John himself intends to come soon. Down there in verse number 13 and 14, Gaius most definitely is not going to have to face this problem alone. He and those other faithful members of the church, they had friends, they had brothers, they had sisters in other congregations. That distance that existed between them would soon be bridged by John's own personal presence. So I think in the end, this letter is a good reminder for those of us, and I believe this firmly, we think that restoration is an important concept that we look to, we're inspired by, we want to try to emulate the faith and the practice of the first century church. That's all right. But the first century church wasn't perfect. It had its problems too. We like to imagine, I think sometimes, that it's this golden age, a place of perfect peace and tranquility and joy and love and unity. And only gradually then did it start to become more contentious as the centuries rolled on. But we know, look at Paul's letters. You can see doctrinal problems that he's dealing with again and again throughout those. But 3 John in particular shows that the church is and always has been made up of imperfect people. Their attitudes, their actions can cause hard feelings. It can cause damage to the gospel message. It can cause damage to the church itself. I asked earlier if we've ever known any Diotrephes in the church. The church is always going to have folks like Diotrephes in it because the church is composed of people. And we're flawed. And naturally, some of us have the sorts of flaws that Diotrephes did. Some of us have some other types of flaws that aren't dealt with here. And yet, the church continues to roll on. Here we are, 2,000 plus years later, despite all those issues, despite all those personality conflicts, despite all those doctrinal disagreements, still here. And I'm thankful that even though I said I've known some Diotrephes types, I've learned a lot more like Demetrius and like Gaius. Thank God for that, those who display those virtues of loyalty and faithfulness and courage and love. Let's all strive to be more like that and not like Diotrephes. Not imitating evil, but imitating good. Anybody with a question or a comment at this point? We're actually 3 or 4 minutes early today. So one was okay, but the others weren't. Yeah, you're right. It does. When you talk about those, whether it's in the church or in the political realm or anything else, we have this natural tendency to demean anyone who disagrees with us as either stupid or evil. I mean, either they're just not smart enough to see things the way that I do, or else they do and they are just outright malicious. There's no other explanation, because the alternative is, hey, I could be wrong. And most of us aren't willing to swallow our pride enough to even entertain that possibility. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for your attention this morning.